games. So is there a link between violent video games and these recurring acts of mass killing in our society? Well, the answer may not be as clear-cut as you think. Joining me now, live from Philadelphia, is Dr. Patrick Markey. He's an associate professor of psychology at Villanova University who researches video game violence. Dr. Markey, let's just get right to it. There's been plenty of research out there which shows a link between violent video games and aggression, but can we go so far to say that playing violent games triggers or leads someone to committing any violent act?
No, it's very difficult to make that kind of claim. That, as you said, we know that violent video games are linked to increases in hostility and so forth, but there's really no evidence to suggest that such violent media is linked to these shootings or really any real-world violence. That what we find in our laboratory studies are very small effects affecting our thoughts, our cognitions, but not so much affecting our actual real behaviors.
What about minds that are psychotic? I suppose it's difficult to tell after the fact when these individuals are often killed, such as the Newtown shooter or the Navy Yard shooter, what triggered anything specifically, but the effect that a violent video game has on a normal college-aged male, those are the subjects of a lot of these studies, or adolescent, may not be the same when it comes to people who have serious mental problems.
No, you might absolutely be correct. The problem is we just don't know yet, that the research really is not there. It's irresponsible for researchers in my field to take research done on, as you said, normal adolescent males and so forth, and then try to generalize those findings to these actual horrific acts, that we're kind of essentially going beyond the data that we've collected in our laboratory when we try to predict it. So you might be right, but I mean, I would guess that the bigger cause of these types of situations are the shooter. I mean, it's already the news reports coming out that, I mean, he probably was paranoid, schizophrenic, and so forth. And looking for whether or not video games contribute to that really seems to be looking at perhaps the smallest effect here, if any.
Is there any evidence that playing these violent video games in which you are playing some sort of a role and shooting a fake gun, etc., has more of an effect in causing aggression, whether it's aggressive thoughts or aggressive acts, than, say, watching a very bloody and violent movie?
No, there are theoretical reasons why violent video games should have a bigger effect than violent television or movies, but empirically there's absolutely no difference. In fact, when we look at meta-analyses, which are big studies done on all the studies done in these areas, what we actually find is the average effect of video games is actually lower than the average effect of movies and television and so forth. And so, at the very least, it's unfair to say that violent video games have a bigger effect on an individual than other violent media.
What do you think, as a researcher, every time there's one of these mass shootings, and they seem to be happening with disturbing and despairing frequency these days, it seems like almost every single time the shooter played these violent video games. I understand a lot of people who think there should be gun restrictions, more gun restrictions, think that even talking about violent video games is changing the subject from the most important thing. What's your reaction as somebody who studies this?
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head, that I think this becomes a red herring, that essentially the profile of most of these shooters are they're males, they're between 20 to 30 years old, and the average age of video gamers is about 30 years old. In fact, it'd be more unusual to find one of these shooters that they didn't play video games. So really finding that they play violent video games is not particularly surprising, considering if you take a random sample of any males, most of them are going to report playing violent video games.
And lastly, sir, as somebody with young children, what do you say to the parents out there in terms of letting their children play Grand Theft Auto 5 or any of these other violent games? I don't know if you have children. Should children be allowed to play? If you had children,
Yeah.
or if you do have children, are they allowed to play?
Yeah, I have two wonderful children, and they're not allowed to play. And it's not because I'm scared that playing Grand Theft Auto is going to turn them into a killer or anything. The reason why we protect our children from violence, from violent video games, even from, discussing, sometimes watching CNN even, is simply because we try to shield our children from this violence. We don't want to make them to be scared. It's not because we're going to make them to be killers. So I think it's a wise idea to not have a child play a violent video game. But that recommendation is not because doing so would turn that child into a killer. It's simply because doing so is exposing that child to something that's going to scare him or her. And as parents, our job is to protect our children.